The gunshots echoed across the savannah at dawn. Another elephant family had been slaughtered for their ivory. But this time was different. Kesi, the oldest matriarch in Maasai Mara National Reserve, had witnessed enough. She was about to lead the park rangers to the heavily armed poacher camp that no human had ever been able to find. The acacia trees stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness of the Maasai Mara, their thorny branches reaching toward stars that were slowly fading into the approaching sunrise. For 47 years, Kesi had walked these same paths, following the ancient migration routes that her grandmother had taught her, leading her family to water and safety with the wisdom that only comes from decades of survival in one of Africa's most dangerous wildernesses. But this morning was different. The crack of high-powered rifles had shattered the peaceful dawn, followed by the agonized trumpeting of elephants in distress, sounds that no creature should ever have to hear. Kesi's massive ears flapped forward as she identified the source of the gunfire, her trunk testing the air for scents that would tell her what her heart already knew. Death had come to the watering hole again. At 62 years old and weighing nearly 6 tons, Kesi was the undisputed matriarch of the largest elephant herd in the Maasai Mara. Her tusks, worn smooth by decades of stripping bark and digging for salt, were themselves a target for the men who brought automatic weapons into her territory. But Kesi had survived this long not through hiding, but through intelligence, memory, and an understanding of both elephant and human behavior that had kept her family alive when so many others had perished. As the matriarch led her herd away, from the sound of gunfire following protocols burned into her memory through generations of survival, she carried with her the faces and scents of every poacher who had invaded her territory. Elephants never forget, and Kesi's memory stretched back through decades of conflict, conservation efforts, and the endless war between those who would protect her species and those who would destroy it for profit. The poaching had intensified over the past 6 months. Entire families of elephants had been found slaughtered, their faces hacked away with chainsaws, their bodies left to rot in the African sun while their ivory was smuggled through networks that stretched from the Kenyan border to markets in Asia. The rangers fought bravely, but they were outgunned, outnumbered, and operating in terrain that favored those who knew how to disappear into the vast wilderness. But Kesi knew things that the rangers didn't. She knew the secret paths through the thorn bush, the hidden water sources, the caves and ravines where armed men could hide for weeks without detection. Most importantly, she knew the scents and sounds that marked the presence of the killers who had turned her home into a war zone. 3 miles away, Senior Ranger Jabari Ochieng was examining the latest massacre with a mixture of rage and despair that had become all too familiar. 4 elephants lay dead around the waterhole, a mother and 3 juveniles, their faces destroyed by chainsaws, their blood mixing with the water that other animals would need to drink. The precision of the kill suggested professional poachers, possibly the same group that had been terrorizing the reserve for months. "They're getting bolder," said Ranger Esther Nakamura, her voice tight with controlled anger as she photographed the scene for evidence. "This is the 3rd family this week, and they're not even trying to hide their tracks anymore." Jabari knelt beside the largest carcass, studying the gunshot patterns. 23 years of anti-poaching work had taught him to read crime scenes like books, and this scene told a story of overwhelming firepower and military precision. "These aren't local opportunists," he said grimly. "This is organized, well-funded, and they have access to serious weapons." The 3rd member of their team, Ranger Marcus Tembo, was examining tracks near the edge of the clearing. "Multiple vehicles, probably military-grade trucks. They came from the northeast and left heading toward the border region." He paused, studying something in the dirt. "But there's something else here." Jabari joined him at the edge of the clearing, where large circular depressions in the soft earth told a different story. "Elephant tracks," he observed. "A large female by the size. She was here after the shooting." "That's what's strange," Marcus continued. "Look at the pattern. She didn't just pass through. She spent time here, walking around the bodies, investigating. And then she left heading northeast, following the same route as the poachers." Esther looked up from her camera. "Elephants do that sometimes. They mourn their dead, try to understand what happened, but following the killers? That's unusual behavior." As they prepared to return to headquarters with their grim evidence, a sound from the tree line caught their attention. A low rumbling, barely audible to human ears, followed by the crack of breaking branches. Something very large was moving through the bush, and it was coming toward them. Kesi emerged from the acacia grove like a gray mountain given life, her massive form moving with surprising grace despite her size. The rangers instinctively reached for their weapons. Lone elephants could be dangerous, especially near fresh kills, but Kesi's body language was unlike anything they had encountered before. She approached to within 20 meters of the rangers and stopped, her trunk extended toward them, testing their scent. Her ears were forward, not flared in aggression, and her eyes, ancient and intelligent, seemed to be studying them with the same intensity that they were studying her. "That's the old matriarch," Esther whispered. "I've seen her before, leading the big herd near the Mara River. She's been around longer than any of us." Kesi began to move again, but slowly, deliberately. She walked to the edge of the clearing, where the poacher vehicles had departed, then turned back to look at the rangers. The message was unmistakable. She wanted them to follow. "This is impossible," Marcus said, checking his rifle to ensure it was ready. "Elephants don't collaborate with humans." But Jabari was watching Kesi's behavior with the keen observation, skills that had kept him alive for 2 decades in the bush. "Maybe they do when they have the same enemy," he said quietly. "She was here after the killers left. She knows where they went." The decision to follow Kesi would either be the most brilliant tactical move in the history of anti-poaching operations, or the last mistake any of them would ever make. The territory she was leading them toward was known to be dangerous. Thick bush, rough terrain, and traditional hideouts for armed criminals. But the rangers had been fighting a losing battle against increasingly sophisticated poaching operations, and conventional tactics had failed to locate the main camps. "We radio for backup," Jabari decided, "but we follow her. If this elephant knows something we don't, we need to find out what it is." The journey into the bush with Kesi as their guide was unlike anything the rangers had experienced in their careers. The massive elephant moved through terrain that would have been nearly impassable for humans, following game trails and ancient migration routes that didn't appear on any map. She would stop periodically to test the air with her trunk, then alter course slightly, following scent trails that were invisible to human senses. After 2 hours of travel, they reached terrain that none of the rangers had seen before, a series of rocky ravines and hidden valleys that were completely concealed from aerial surveillance. Kesi's pace slowed, and her body language became more cautious. They were approaching something dangerous. The first sign of the poacher camp was the smell. Wood smoke mixed with the stench of rotting meat and human waste. Kesi led them to a high ridge overlooking a hidden valley, where the sight below made all 3 rangers reach for their radios simultaneously. Hidden among the rocks and thorn bush was the largest illegal ivory operation any of them had ever seen. Dozens of military-style tents, vehicles with mounted machine guns, and what appeared to be a processing facility where elephant tusks were being sorted and prepared for transport. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and the discipline of their movement suggested military training. "My God," Esther whispered into her radio. "We've found it, the main camp. There must be 50 people down there and enough ivory to represent hundreds of dead elephants." But as they called for backup and began planning their approach, Kesi was conducting her own reconnaissance. The old matriarch had positioned herself where she could see the entire camp, and her intelligent eyes were cataloging every detail. The number of guards, the location of weapons, the routes in and out of the valley. She had been planning this moment for months. The memories that drove Kesi's determination stretched back through years of loss and violence. She remembered her own mother, killed by poachers when Kesi was barely 20 years old. She remembered her sister found dying with her face hacked away, leaving behind orphaned calves that Kesi had raised as her own. She remembered dozens of family members, friends, and gentle giants who had been murdered for the ivory that grew from their faces. But most vividly, she remembered the scents and voices of the men who had brought this death to her family. The leader of this camp, a tall man with distinctive scarring on his hands, had been present at her mother's killing 30 years ago. He had grown older, richer, and more heavily armed, but his scent was unmistakable to Kesi's memory. Today, that debt would be paid. The Rangers' backup arrived within hours, a combined force of Kenya Wildlife Service personnel, anti-poaching units, and military advisors. The plan they developed was complex, involving multiple approach routes and coordinated timing to prevent the poachers from escaping with their weapons and ivory stockpile. But they hadn't accounted for Kesi's own plans. As the human assault team prepared to move into position, Kesi began her own advance. The old matriarch had spent decades learning to move silently through the bush when necessary, skills that had kept her alive through countless encounters with predators, both animal and human. Now she put that knowledge to use as she approached the camp from an angle that no human strategist would have considered. The first indication that something was wrong came from the camp's perimeter guards. The man stationed at the northwestern approach point simply vanished. One moment he was there, the next moment his position was empty, his weapon left behind in the dirt. His partner investigated, calling softly, and then he too disappeared. Kesi was conducting her own operation, using methods that millions of years of evolution had perfected. A 6-ton elephant could move through thick bush without making a sound when necessary, and her trunk was capable of lifting a grown man with the same ease that a human might pick up a small child. By the time the human rangers began their assault, Kesi had already neutralized half of the camp's security perimeter. The guards she encountered found themselves face to face with an intelligence that they had underestimated, and a strength that no human weapon could match at close range. The raid itself was swift and decisive, caught between the coordinated human assault and Kesi's unexpected intervention from within their own perimeter. The poachers found themselves outflanked and overwhelmed. Those who tried to flee discovered that the ancient migration routes they had never bothered to map were blocked by an elephant who knew every path through the bush. The camp's leader, the scarred man whose scent Kesi had never forgotten, made his last mistake when he tried to escape through the ravine where Kesi had positioned herself. When he found his path blocked by the massive matriarch, he raised his weapon with the same casual brutality that had ended hundreds of elephant lives. But Kesi was not a helpless animal trapped at a watering hole. She was a warrior with 30 years of memories and the wisdom of her species flowing through her. The scarred man's weapon never fired. The aftermath of the raid revealed the true scope of the operation that Kesi had helped destroy. The ivory stockpile represented over 400 elephants, including entire family groups that had been wiped out over the past 2 years. The weapons cache included military-grade equipment that had been stolen from government armories. The communication equipment revealed connections to smuggling networks that stretched across 3 countries. But for Kesi, the most important discovery was a collection of photographs that the poachers had kept as trophies, images of their kills, including one that showed a young, scarred man standing over the body of a female elephant 30 years ago, the same man who would never threaten another elephant family. In the days that followed, as investigators processed the evidence and journalists covered the story of the elephant who had led rangers to the largest poaching bust in African history, Kesi quietly returned to her herd. The old matriarch said nothing to the reporters who wanted to interview her handlers, showed no interest in the accolades being heaped upon the rangers she had helped. She had done what needed to be done. The debt had been paid. Senior Ranger Jabari found her a week later at the same watering hole where the latest massacre had occurred. But now it was peaceful again, filled with elephants, zebras, and other animals drinking safely in the African sunshine. "I don't know if you can understand me," he said quietly, standing at a respectful distance from the massive matriarch. "But what you did saved more than just your own species. You showed us that we're fighting the same war." Kesi looked at him with those ancient, intelligent eyes, and for a moment Jabari felt that she understood every word. Then she turned away, leading her family toward the distant hills where new grass was growing, and the future seemed a little brighter. The success of the raid led to a fundamental change in anti-poaching strategy throughout East Africa. Rangers began working more closely with local elephant populations, learning to read their behavior and recognize when they were trying to communicate threats or opportunities. Kesi herself became an unofficial partner in the ongoing effort to protect the Maasai Mara. Dr. Patricia Wanjiku, the park's chief veterinarian, spent months studying Kesi's behavior and intelligence. "What we witnessed wasn't just animal instinct," she reported to conservation conferences around the world. "It was planning, memory, and moral reasoning that rival human intelligence." Kesi understood that the poachers were a threat, not just to her family, but to the entire ecosystem. She chose to act on that understanding. The technology that had been recovered from the poacher camp led to the breakup of smuggling rings operating across Kenya, Tanzania, and Somalia. Over 200 people were arrested in coordinated raids, and the price of illegal ivory rose dramatically as supply chains were disrupted. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the relationship between humans and elephants in the Maasai Mara. Rangers reported that elephant behavior became more cooperative, with matriarchs like Kesi actively leading humans away from dangerous areas or toward suspicious activities. "It's as if they understand that we're on the same side," Esther observed during one of her regular patrols. "They're not just animals we're protecting, they're partners in protecting themselves." Marcus, who had initially been skeptical of following an elephant into dangerous territory, became one of the program's strongest advocates. "Kesi taught us that intelligence isn't just about tools and technology," he said. "Sometimes the best intelligence comes from those who know the territory better than we ever could." The story of Kesi's raid attracted international attention, bringing increased funding and resources to anti-poaching efforts throughout Africa. But more importantly, it changed how conservationists thought about the animals they were protecting. "We've been trying to save elephants from humans," Dr. Wanjiku explained to a gathering of wildlife biologists. "What Kesi showed us is that elephants can save themselves, and us, if we're smart enough to listen to them." 5 years after the raid, the Maasai Mara had become one of the safest reserves in Africa for elephant populations. Poaching incidents dropped by over 80%, and the elephant population began to recover for the first time in decades. Kesi, now in her late 60s, continued to lead her family through the seasonal migrations that her ancestors had followed for thousands of years. But she also continued her partnership with the rangers, occasionally leading them to suspicious activities or warning them away from dangerous areas. The scar-faced poachers camp had been turned into a research station where scientists studied elephant intelligence and behavior. A bronze plaque at the entrance honored Kesi's contribution to conservation, but the old matriarch herself seemed uninterested in human recognition. She had more important work to do, teaching the next generation of elephants how to survive in a world where wisdom, memory, and cooperation between species could mean the difference between extinction and hope. On quiet evenings, when the African sun painted the savanna in shades of gold and red, rangers would sometimes see Kesi standing on the ridge where she had first shown them the poacher camp. She would remain there for long minutes, her trunk testing the wind, her ancient eyes scanning the territory that she had helped make safe, watching, remembering, ready to act when justice called again. The bond between Kesi and the rangers had proven that the fight for conservation was not just about humans protecting animals, but about different species recognizing their shared stake in the future of the natural world. In leading those rangers to the poacher camp, Kesi had not just saved elephant lives. She had shown that the future of Africa's wildlife would be determined by the willingness of different species to stand together against those who would destroy them all. Her legacy lived on in every calf that grew up without fear of chainsaws, in every watering hole that remained peaceful, and in every ranger who looked to the elephant herds not just as animals to be protected, but as allies in a war that could only be won together.